Hi, Dennis.
How are you, Rabbi?
Thank God well. And you?
Right, good. No, all right, thank you.
Excellent. Baruch Hashem.
Just waiting for a few more people to join.
Yeah, I got an apology from one of the regulars.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, we got competition from Tito and Bueni, so
Oh, okay.
the budget speech happening, right?
Right now, gee whiz,
I think it's actually, I think the main speech starts at 2, if I'm not mistaken, but I guess there's
Oh, okay.
we'll wait and see.
All right.
So I'm just finishing, I'm looking away because I'm just trying to finish off 1, 2 things quickly before we're ready to start the shiur.
Martin Greenberg. And Jeff Sosinski.
Hello, Rabbi.
Hello.
Hi, Jeff. Hi, Martin.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Okay, we almost there at 1 o'clock. I'll share the screen in a moment and we can get started. Okay.
There's everybody else.
Okay, let's get started. I mentioned I think we got some competition with the budget speech today, but we've got more than a Mazuman here, so we certainly go ahead and we'll learn together. And it's not unusual that some people join a bit late. Okay, I'm going to share the screen, and we're now coming right to the end of the laws of marriage, basically, with the 24th chapter. Tomorrow is the 25th chapter, and we'll have the final laws in this section of the Rambam, and then we move on to the next, which is the laws around divorce. Okay, what we're going to deal with today is the repayment or the payment of the ketubah at the end of a marriage, divorce or death, but where the marriage itself was questionable, and we'll see what those scenarios are. Either because the very foundation of marriage is not kosher, either biblically or rabbinically, or because something happened during the course of the marriage that undermined that marriage and therefore compromises what the repayment will be. Basically, when a marriage is dissolved either through divorce or on passing, so the woman is entitled to her ksuba, right? Now the ksuba will have a number of things. It will have the primary amount, it will have the tosefet, the additional amount that the husband had committed to, and then there's the dowry, what she brought into the marriage. And you remember there are 2 types of property that she could bring into the marriage. One which she retains ownership of, and the other one which comes into the marriage, kind of joint ownership, but the husband can have certain benefits from it. So essentially, if she divorces, she can in a kind of kosher marriage all the way through, she claims on all those 4 things. One is that the marriage was not as it should have been, which is the topic of this chapter, and we'll go through each of those aspects of payment. What is still due to her, what is not, and what might the husband still be liable for, and what not. Okay, first halakha we'll read. Can you see it on the screen there? Is it all clear?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So the first halacha, it's a long-ish chapter, so I'll stick just to the English so we manage to get through it. I'm looking slightly to the side because I've got my notes over here. I'm not even sure if you can see my face on the screen, but if you'll understand why I'm looking slightly to the side. So when a man marries an Eilonit, you'll remember that an Eilonit is a woman who is incapable of childbirth, okay, and does not have another wife with whom he will father children. He is compelled to divorce her. This is based on laws that we learned earlier. And the situation over here is that it's a marriage that really is not sustainable. He eventually will be forced to divorce her. Nevertheless, during and after the marriage, the financial arrangements that govern other women govern her. In other words, here's a situation where they both go in knowing what the situation was. They both willingly get into this marriage. So therefore, she's entitled to the fundamental requirements of the ketuvah and all the provisions of the ketuvah, all additional things. Similarly, her husband acquires the same financial privileges with regard to her as he would with regard to other women. In other words, from the things that she brings into the marriage, the benefits that he's allowed to benefit from. When we talk about what we call the nichtzei tzon barzel, where there's certain benefits that he accrues from those things in the dowry, those he will get to keep in such a marriage. In other words, it's not a marriage that ultimately will last, but they were both fully aware of what the situation is. Halacha 2. If I have a man married a woman without recognizing a condition, in other words, she doesn't let him know that she's incapable of bearing children, and later it was discovered that she was an idoless. Or another example, or this woman is forbidden to marry him by virtue of a negative commandment. An example of that is a divorcee is not allowed to marry a Kohen, or a Kohen is not allowed to marry a divorcee. So he meets a woman, she conceals the fact that she'd been previously married, and he marries her. So in that situation, she's not entitled to the fundamental requirements of the ketubah, nor to any of the provisions of the ketubah. She is entitled to the extra amount that the husband added to the fundamental requirements of the ketubah. That means like this, right? In the ketubah, there's the basic amount. She doesn't get that because that was there to protect her. But she has come into this situation in a devious way, if you want. However, the additional amount that he puts into the ketubah is basically what a husband agrees to pay for the benefit and the pleasure that he has of an intimate relationship with this woman. And because he did have that benefit, even though technically the marriage is flawed, that part of the ketubah he still has to pay her. So the fundamental obligation of the ketubah, he's not technically required to pay. The basic commitment of the ketubah he's not required to pay, because that was all there to protect her and provide for her as a wife that is halachically okay. But the addition he would have to pay. The couple should be forced to separate. When that is done, the value of the produce of which the husband partook is not expropriated from him. Again, because we don't take away, even though technically it was not a kosher marriage, so there's benefit that he had from her property that technically may not have been due to him because it's not a kosher marriage, but because she was the one that tricked him into it, he doesn't have to pay her back for it. And the same law applies when a woman marries a shnia. A shnia is somebody who's forbidden to marry from a rabbinic decree. As the Torah lists numerous women that a man cannot marry, people that are related. There's shnia is a further relative. I mean, it sounds odd, but a great-grandmother, for example, and that would be a rabbinic prohibit to marry, and the same thing would apply there. But in that instance, we'll see that it's true whether or not he knew or didn't know about the prohibition or about what her relationship to him was. Whereas in the first instances, he had to know, he would only have to pay the tosefet, the additional, if he didn't know, and she would forgo her basics if he didn't know. But in the case where they both knew, she would get everything as we learned in the first halacha. The third halacha, why are these women not, see, and this actually just articulates some of the points that I've made. Rambam clarifies. Why are these women not granted the essential requirements of the ketubah when they are granted the extra sum added by the husband? In other words, let's focus on the example where she was a woman who could not bear children, but she never let her husband know that. So he says the fundamental requirement of the ketubah was instituted by sages so that a man should not think that divorcing his wife is a light matter. It was there to protect her. Since he was not aware of the prohibition of his wife's condition, his wife's condition, in other words, whether it was someone who he was a Kohen married to someone he's not aware that she was previously married, or a man marries a woman and he doesn't know, but she does know that she can't bear children. In both those cases, she's not granted the essential requirement of the ksuba. With regard to the extra amount for which he's obligated himself, as long as she desired to maintain the relationship, she kept a part of the agreement. She granted him marital satisfaction and is willing to continue the relationship. It is the Torah that deems her to be forbidden. And therefore, she gets the extra amount because that's what he committed to. What then can she do? Therefore, she is granted this extra amount, for it is not her deeds that cause her to be forbidden after marriage. She was forbidden beforehand, and because he offered that extra amount for the practical benefit that he gets in the marriage, and he's that much he did actually get out of the marriage, so then he must still pay that. Halacha 4. Okay. Why did I say to not distinguish between a shnia? This is somebody again who's rabbinically prohibited from being married, whom her husband recognized, and one that she did not recognize. Now, as we don't say that it's only if he, in the case where the woman couldn't bear children, we said only if he wasn't aware, then she doesn't get her ksuba. When it says when he marries somebody who he shouldn't have married because of rabbinic law, whether he knew or didn't know, either way she doesn't get the ksuba. And the explanation is because the prohibition involved in these relationships is rabbinic in origin, and they reinforced it. In other words, the reason why they want people to lose out kind of from such a marriage in the case of divorce, when they're forced to divorce, is because they don't want people to think that it's that to take this rabbinic law lightly. So it's like a penalty to remind people that this is actually a stringent law. It's a rabbinic law, but it's a stringent law. If by contrast, a man married a woman who he was forbidden to marry because of a negative prohibition of the Torah, that was not punishable with death, and he was aware of the prohibition, his wife is entitled to the money due to her by virtue of the ksuba. So again, this is the example would be if a kohen marries a divorcee. He's not allowed to marry her, but if he does marry her, his commitment to her is binding. Similarly, if he marries a woman who is forbidden to marry because of a positive commandment, whether he was aware of the prohibition or not. So this is basically, there were certain nations that one was not allowed to marry into the Jewish people for 2 or 3 generations, and they would be able to marry subsequent to that. So if you marry someone from those nations earlier on, a 2nd or 3rd generation, then that's considered marrying someone who's forbidden because of a positive command. And in that instance, whether they're aware of the prohibition or not, she would be entitled to the ksuba. And this is the rationale, that he recognized that a woman was forbidden by a negative, that if he recognized that a woman was forbidden by a negative prohibition, he will willingly undertook to damage his resources. And as he knew that he wasn't supposed to do this, he knew that the marriage will be dissolved, and therefore he has to pay those commitments. It's not like anybody tricked him into this. And in regard to the relations which are forbidden because of a positive command, the prohibition is lighter. In both these instances, the women are entitled to support from their husband's estate after his death. Because that's part of the ksuba, right? His obligation to take care of her basic necessities. Similarly, if during his absence they borrowed money for their sustenance, the husband is allowed to pay. This is an instant, for example, the husband is always liable to take care of his wife's basic needs. What if a husband is out of town and she needs to feed the family or herself, so she goes and borrows money. So in a normal situation, what happens is the husband comes back, he has to repay the loan. She borrowed money, but she's not borrowing money for herself. She's borrowing money to provide for those needs which the husband is obligated to. So in this instance, if that loan had not been yet repaid, he would have to pay that back, because this is something that he went into with his eyes wide open. And when the husband is forced to divorce, right, he knew that he wasn't supposed to in that marriage. He's going to be forced to get divorced. He had taken on that commitment. He's forced to reimburse her for all the benefit that he received from her property. So this is the other side. Now, because he knew he was engaged in a marriage that was prohibited to him. So remember, there's certain things that a woman brings into the marriage, what we call the nichse tzon barzel, which he benefits from. Or even the nichse meluk, that it belonged to her, but she brings it into the marriage. During the marriage, he's allowed to benefit from those things. But because in retrospect, it turns out when they're forced to get divorced, that the whole marriage was not a kosher marriage, that means he's been benefiting from her unduly. He's enjoying the profits of her property when they're not actually in a kosher marriage. He would have to pay her back for those things. Okay, and as we'll see, this is the consistent kind of rationale. Where the marriage is not a marriage, technically halachically, then the basics of the ksuba do not go to her, and he must repay for those things that he benefited from. Okay, A woman who dissolves a marriage through the right of miyun is not entitled to ksuba. Now, miyun is like this. There were certain times when a young woman would be, or a young girl actually, would be married off by the courts to an individual. She has the possibility that once she becomes adult, that she can refuse this marriage and walk out. Okay? If she chooses to walk out, which is her absolute right, she can do that. She's not forced to stay in the marriage. Circumstances in her childhood, maybe she didn't have a father and nobody to support her, and the court felt that if she marries a certain individual, that way she'll get support. That was one of the circumstances where something like this would happen. But she's given the right that when she's adult, she can walk out. That's fine. She can walk out, but she doesn't get a ksuba. She's not only, she is entitled to the extra amount. The husband is not required to reimburse her for the benefit that he received from her property. In other words, because the marriage was a marriage, even though she has the right to leave when she wants to leave, the marriage is considered a marriage. And that's why he doesn't have to reimburse her for any benefit that she gets from her property. And although she won't get the basics of the ksuba, she will get anything additional. And the reason why she won't get the basics is because he took it on, but he always knew that it was a risk. But if she borrowed money for her substance while she was still his wife, and after his terminated marriage through the right of miyun, that money is not expropriated from the husband. In other words, we mitigate his risk because he's taking on the responsibility, hoping that this marriage will continue, but he's always got this risk that she might walk out on him. So the extra things that he offers, he knows it's a known risk that he's taking, and therefore he have to pay for it. But the basics that are put there to protect her, only there to protect her if they willingly kind of engage in their marriage. But if she shows that by leaving she's not happy with it, he doesn't have to bear that loss. Halacha 6. When a woman commits adultery, her husband is obligated to divorce her. She's not entitled to a ksuba. Neither the fundamental requirement nor the additional amount, nor is she entitled to any of the conditions of ksuba. And the rationale is like this. It is her own deeds that cause her to become forbidden to her husband. Basically, this is the most severe instance where a woman is, and this there's certain criteria over here that would define committing adultery. It must be in the presence of witnesses and warning and so on. But if that's what happens, she loses her rights to any of this repayments. Okay, what is the law? So that's what we've spoken about, basically all types of marriages and the basic payments that come as a result of the ksuba. What happens to the additional elements of the ksuba? So, what is the law with regard to the rights of these women to their dowries? Whether a woman's dowry endures, whenever a woman's dowry endures, she's entitled to take her property when she leaves her husband's household after divorce. This applies even when she commits adultery. Okay, so again, the most severe case of that causes divorce or forces divorce is if a woman commits adultery. Then the Beis Din will force them to divorce. As we said, she doesn't get a ksuba. She doesn't get any additional to the ksuba, and she cannot claim any of the maintenance, not back pay and not forward pay. She gets no maintenance going forward, right? But what she does get, the one thing that she can do is the property that she actually brought in or asset that she brought in, she takes them as they are. She can't claim additional value or whatever if it devalued, but she takes them as they are. Now, if the property is not intact, the following laws applies. If the woman was a shniya or forbidden as a result of positive commandment, whether or not her husband was aware of the prohibition, the same laws that apply to other women with regard to the dowries apply to her. Similarly, if the woman was an aylanut or was forbidden because of a negative prohibition of the Torah, the same laws that apply to other women with regard to their dowries apply to her. What are those laws? So we'll see now others. Other than basically we're saying everyone other than someone who committed adultery would get more than just what the woman who committed adultery is, which is she only gets to take out that which is still there. So what does she get? What are these laws? So as follows. The husband is liable for nichsei tzon ba'azel. With regard to nichsei melog, if anything was lost or stolen, she suffers loss. The husband is not liable to pay. Basically, there are two types of property, as we mentioned, or that a woman brings into the marriage. That which gets written into the ksuba, the tzon ba'azel, which they now share ownership and he gets benefit from those things, or the nichsei melog, which is something that she retains complete ownership of it. So the nichsei melog, she takes it as it is, and if it was stolen or lost, she has to bear that loss. The husband doesn't have to pay her. But the nichsei tzon ba'azel, he would be liable to pay. In other words, the benefits that he gets from those things that were brought into the ksuba. Now he says different rules apply when a woman is either an aylanut or prohibited because of a negative commandment. Remember, the aylanut is someone who cannot give birth. the one who is prohibited because of negative commandment, an example of that is a divorcee married to a Kohen. And if the situation were that he doesn't know this about her, in other words, she is tricking him into this, so then whatever was lost, stolen, destroyed, or damaged from the Nichse Tzon Barzel, her husband is not liable to pay, right? Because he was taken advantage of here. He was deceived. For she gave him permission to use them. She gave him permission to use them, right? But she didn't let him know that they weren't actually technically in marriage, in retrospect. With regard to Nichse Melog, by contrast, that's what she brings in and never really, she always retains the ownership of. Whatever was lost or stolen, he is liable to pay. Okay, so this is an interesting scenario, right? Because this is the opposite of all other women. Since the marriage bond is not of a binding nature, he did not acquire the rights to use the Nichse Melog. What's interesting over here is that those properties that she retains ownership of and he's benefiting from, he's benefiting as a so-called outsider. Because technically speaking, in retrospect, as we mentioned earlier also, he didn't really have rights to those things. So then he would be liable to make repayments for that. Halacha 9. A woman who dissolves a marriage to the right of miyun is not entitled to any compensation at all for the property that was destroyed. Nothing is expropriated from her husband in payment for that which was lost or stolen. With regard to both these type of properties brought into marriage, whether it's the Nichse Melog or the Nichse Tzon Barzel, instead she takes whatever property is intact and departs, I guess, similar in a way to the woman who had committed adultery. And I suppose that connection, we have the same law, brings us now to the continuation of this discussion around what exactly occurs. In other words, what happens when a woman commits adultery? As we mentioned, the woman who commits adultery doesn't get anything from a ksuva, not the fundamental requirement, not the extra amount that he put in. Nor is the husband held responsible for any of her nichse tzon barzel that were lost or stolen. Needless to say, this ruling also applies with regard to her nichse melog, something which he never really took ownership or responsibility for. The above does not apply only to adulteress, but also to a woman who violates the faith of Moshe. Again, adulteress is someone whose witnesses will testify to her indiscretion. And she would have been warned about that behavior. In that instance, the Beis Hillel will force them to get divorced. What we're going to talk about now is other aspects where a woman in a marriage behaves in a way that's unbecoming, as we'll define, according to the Torah law and according to rabbinic law, or according to accepted custom. And in that instance, the rabbis basically say the husband has a right to divorce her. They may even encourage a divorce her, but he's not obligated to divorce her. And in those situations, we'll see how that affects her ksuva or other monetary claims. So he says the above does not apply only to the adulteress, but also to a woman who violates the faith of Moshe. All these things we will define in the coming halachot, okay? Violates the faith of Moshe, or one who violates the Jewish faith, or one who is divorced because of a scandalous report. So all these women are not entitled to ksuba, not the fundamentals, not the extra amount, and they're not granted any of the conditions of the ksuba. So the result will be similar or the same as an adulteress. When these women are divorced, each one should take what remains from her dowry and depart. Her husband is not liable to pay her anything, neither what was reduced in value nor what was lost. The results for her, in other words, even though they're not obligated to divorce, but the husband chooses to divorce, she loses all rights. So what exactly are these situations? Someone who violates the faith of Moshe, someone that violates Jewish faith. We'll go through them one at a time. The following are the actions for which a woman is considered to have violated the faith of Moshe. Okay? He gives a few examples. Going out to the marketplace with her hair uncovered. Okay? So there's halacha. It should be known that this practice changed. In other words, it's clear. Basically, we're going to learn right at the end of this chapter the laws of the Sota woman. The law of the Sota woman is a woman who is accused or whose husband is suspicious that she's having an affair, and he warns her against going into seclusion with a particular man who he has this suspicion about. The Torah then says that she comes before the priest when she goes through to drink the Sota waters, and her hair is then uncovered. And the implication is that otherwise, a married woman would be walking around with her hair covered as an expression of modesty. Now, those practices have changed over the years. It's not as common. So we must understand this in the context at a time when that was regular, that a married woman went with her hair covered always. So if now a woman goes out with her hair uncovered, she's considered to be going against and violating basically a biblical expectation. Another example would be taking vows or oaths that she does not keep. So her husband finds out about it. Or engaging in sexual relations with her husband while in a nida state. Right? There's times in a marriage, even in a marriage, where a woman and man cannot be together. And she brings him into intimacy at a time when she knows she's a nida, but he doesn't, and then he finds out afterwards. Or, for example, failing to separate challah, or feeding her husband food that is forbidden to eat, so feeding him treif. Needless to say, this applies to forbidden calling animals and animals that were not ritually slaughtered. It applies even to produce that was not tithed. In other words, she's feeding him stuff and saying it is one thing when it's something else, and it's something forbidden. So in all these instances, this is considered someone who violates the faith of Moshe and is grounds for divorce. Again, it's not something he would be forced to divorce her for. He can choose to remain married, but if he chooses to divorce her because of these things, because they are verified, then she loses all the rights as we've discussed. How can the latter two matters be known? Okay, for example, she said, so-and-so the priest separated tithes from this produce for me, or so-and-so separated challah from this dough. So-and-so the sage said that this stain does not render me a nida. And after eating the food or engaging in sexual relations, the husband asks the person whose name was mentioned, and that individual denies the occurrence or the incident. So you're following, right? He notices on her undergarments that there's a stain. And he says, aren't you, does this mean that you are now nida and we shouldn't be intimate? And she says, no, I took it to the rabbi. The rabbi said that stain is not considered tameh. And he takes her on her word. Then he bumps into the rabbi and he says, oh, my wife said she came to ask you. He says, no such thing. Or he says, she spoke to me and I said it was tameh. So he now finds out that she tricked him into having relations at a time when they shouldn't have. Now, what's fascinating over here, this is an interesting, just keep this in mind. It's an amazing thing, right? Really what's going on is this man now has his wife's word against this rabbi's word. And it seems to be saying that we're saying you should trust this guy, the Kohen in the case of the tithing, or the rabbi in the case of the determining whether something is a nid or not, rather than his wife. Why? It seems a little bit odd. Isn't it one against one? And maybe you should be trusting your wife more than the other person. So the answer is like this: because the claim of the wife is reliance on the word of that individual, you need confirmation from that individual. And if that individual denies what's being said in their name, that's considered more powerful. Just an interesting concept that comes through over here. Just another example, if a woman's conduct caused it to be established in her neighborhood that she was in a niddah state, but she told her husband that she was ritually pure, and then he engages in relations, and afterwards he finds out that she was in a niddah state, that would be another way in which he kind of finds out that she had tricked him. So now we know what's considered someone who goes against the faith of Moshe, right? What's considered going against the so-called Jewish faith? So we'll see these are lesser things. These are so-called customary things that she doesn't adhere to. What is meant by the Jewish faith? The custom of modesty that the Jewish woman practice. When a woman performs any of the following acts, she is considered to have violated the Jewish faith. Example 1, she goes to the marketplace or lane with openings on both heads. In other words, there's a place where the public can see her. Her head is not fully covered, meaning her hair is covered with a handkerchief, but not with a veil like all the women would cover their head. So it's different to the first case where she goes out completely uncovered. Second one is where she spins flax or wool with a rose on her face or on her forehead or on her cheek, like immodest Gentile woman. Again, this seems to be some type of practice to make herself look attractive in public, which was unbecoming. Or C, she spins in the marketplace and shows her forearms to the men. In other words, she's wearing clothing that is modest, but she allows herself to be exposed in a way that's immodest. Or she plays frivolously with young lads. Or she demands sexual intimacy from her husband in a loud voice until her neighbors hear her talking about their intimate affairs. And another example, she courses her husband's father in her husband's presence. All these, again, are considered to be going against the so-called faith, the Jewish faith. These are customs of modesty or modest practice that she is, going against, and would be grounds for divorce. Halacha 13. Now, this is an interesting scenario. Ezra, right, who was the leader of the men of the Great Assembly, led the Jews back to the rebuilding of the Second Temple. He enacted a number of decrees. One of those decrees was that a woman should wear a belt. It's a little bit unclear what this means. According to Rashi, it seems to be that a woman should always wear an undergarment in her home at all times. I guess today it's pretty common. Maybe back in the day it was not necessarily as common. And the idea was actually to give some level of protection against rape. And it was considered, therefore, an expression of modesty. So now you might say that if a woman does not adhere to this level of modesty, that would also be going against so-called Jewish custom. He says, however, if a woman does not wear such a belt, however, she's not considered to have violated the faith of Moshe, nor does she forfeit her ksuba. Similarly, if she goes from the courtyard to courtyard without having her hair fully covered, so now we're talking about in a kind of a common area, but not necessarily a public area, as long as it's covered with a handkerchief, she is not considered to have violated the Jewish faith. Okay, so exposing one's hair in public is different to doing so, or at least partially, in a semi-private or semi-public area, in a common area. And that would be an exception to what we said above. Okay, now in all these cases, is it just that the husband decides, okay, I think my wife's walking around without her hair uncovered, and he just says, okay, fine, grounds for divorce, taking it to the best, and I'm writing a get, and you get no ksuba. So we see over here, no, there has to be verification. A woman who violated the faith must have had a warning issued to her prior to having performed the act, and the warning and her improper conduct must be observed by witnesses before she forfeits her ksuba. Okay, so it's not just an arbitrary thing. We're talking about where there was a warning for this behavior and it was witnessed, and then she would lose the ksuba, as we're saying the law is over here. The following rules applies when a woman transgresses privately. So there's no warning and there's no witnesses. But her husband knows that she violated the faith and therefore gives her a warning. But the warning was not observed by witnesses, and then she transgresses again. In other words, the husband sees the one day she walks out without her hair covered. She says, listen, it's immodest. You shouldn't be walking around without your hair covered. She doesn't get the warning from an external party, and nobody else sees her do it. But he sees her going out again the next day to the market without her hair covered. Should the husband claim that she violated the faith after receiving a warning, and the woman claims not to have transgressed or not to have received the warning, so it's his word against hers, he comes to court and says, listen, I warned her, and she's gone out again and done this immodest thing, and I want to divorce her. She says, no such thing. I never did that. Or she says, it's true, I walked out once, but you never warned me about it. So what happens in that instance? So because there's no proof, he would still owe her the ksuba. However, he can demand of her that she actually takes an oath to that effect. So as you see that, the husband must pay her the money due to her by the virtue of the ksuba if she tries to divorce her, after she takes an oath that she has not transgressed. In other words, he can make her take an oath, because if she has transgressed, she loses her ksuba, right? The oath is required because she would not be entitled to any payment if she admitted to having transgressed after receiving this warning. Okay, halacha 15. What is meant by a woman who is divorced because of a scandalous report? Right? That's the third category that we mentioned above. It says, for example, there were witnesses that she performed a very indecent act that indicates that a sin was committed, but there is no definitive testimony. What are examples? She was alone in her courtyard and they saw a perfume salesman leaving. They then go into the courtyard afterwards and they see her getting up from her bed and she's getting dressed. And they find wet spittle on the counter of the bed. In other words, it means there was someone there lying there together with her. So there's basically what we're saying is there's circumstantial evidence that she had engaged in an illicit affair. Alternatively, they saw them coming, her and a man that's not her husband, coming out of a dark place together. Or one of them is helping the other up from a trench or the like. Or they saw him kissing her in the opening of her cloak. Or they saw them kissing each other or embracing each other. Or they entered into a room one after the other and they locked the door and there was enough time for them to engage in a certain act. So all of these things are circumstantial evidence, so to speak, of an illicit act. And these, and because this was witnessed, this is considered as creating a scandalous report, okay? In all these instances, if her husband, in all these instances, that's the scandalous report and the previous two things, going against the faith of Moshe, the faith of Jews, if her husband desires to divorce her, she is not entitled to receive the money due to her by the virtue of her ksuba, and there's no necessity for a warning. That's in this case where there's the scandalous report, and that is because there are witnesses to that very, very questionable encounter, and good, strong circumstantial evidence that something untoward took place. So if he accepts their report, he divorces her. Now, when a woman violates the faith of Moshe, as we discussed above, or the Jewish faith, and similarly one of whom is issued a scandalous report, her husband is not compelled. This is the point I made earlier. He doesn't have to divorce her, but if he desires to remain married, he need not divorce her. Nevertheless, even when her husband does not divorce her, she's still not entitled to a ksuba. In other words, if he doesn't divorce her right away, but a number of years later he does choose to divorce her, she will not be entitled to the ksuba. This is the Rambam's view. There are those commentators who say that if she kind of corrects her ways and now behaves as is becoming continuously, and she's kind of done a teshuvah, then maybe her ksuba rights would be reinstated. Although according to the Rambam, they never get reinstated. Ksuba was ordained by our sages, and the rationale is this, right? The ksuba was ordained in order to protect her, that her husband should not consider divorcing her lightly. But that's when a woman is behaving modestly. But if she herself shows that she's not committed to the sanctity of the marriage, then they have no problem that the husband should be willing to let her go, so to speak, in divorce, and therefore they'll take away the necessity for him to pay out that ksuba. Halacha 17, when a man sees his wife commit adultery. So again, the committing adultery is in the presence of witnesses after warning. What happens if there were no witnesses? There was no warning. But the husband himself, he says he saw her commit adultery. Or he was informed of this by one of his relatives or her relatives, whether male or female, whom he trusts. In other words, somebody comes and tells him in confidence, and it's somebody he trusts implicitly, right? Then he's obligated to divorce her and is forbidden to engage in relations with her, for he relies on their words as true. If he doesn't believe them, he doesn't have to. But if he accepts their words as true, as we said, they're not allowed to remain married, and he must divorce her. He must have a payer the money due to her by virtue of civility. So this is an interesting situation. Although he's forced to divorce her, because there is not valid evidence that can be brought to the court, i.e. two witnesses, she does not fulfill her ksuba, so he has to divorce her and he has to pay her the money of the ksuba. Unless she herself admits that she had committed adultery. So in other words, in a situation where there was a report, he saw her, or somebody very trustworthy close to them saw her, and she admits, then again she would forfeit her ksuba. Therefore, her husband saw her commit adultery. He can require her to take an oath while she holds a sacred oath that she did not commit adultery while she was married to him. Okay, so again, if he saw her, he would have to pay her the ksuba. He has to divorce her, he'd have to pay her the ksuba, unless she admits to having had an affair. If she's not willing to admit it, he can force her to swear that she did not. And then she would collect her ksuba. Okay, but if she's not willing to take that oath, then he would not have to pay her. With regard to other matters, or if somebody else told him, in other words, he didn't see himself, but somebody else told him something trustworthy, then he cannot require you to take an oath except through the convention of Gilgul. Gilgul Shvua means that sometimes when a person is anywhere else, there's an obligatory oath, we can compel them to take an additional oath. But so again, in this situation, if the husband himself sees her, he can compel her to take an oath that if she says she was not engaged in an affair, he can compel her to take an oath. If he gets a report from somebody trustworthy, he would not be able to compel her to take that oath, even though he trusts them, but he would be able to roll an additional oath on her if anyway she was made to take some other type of oath to him. Halacha 18. When a woman, see we're going already a little bit over, I hope you don't mind, we got 7 more halachot. I should be about, I guess about 7-8 minutes or so we should be done. Okay, halacha 18. When a woman tells her husband that she willingly committed adultery, no attention is paid to her words. Interesting, right? Before we said if he saw her and she admits, we accept her word. Here we're saying if a woman comes home one day and says, oh, by the way, I've been having an affair with so-and-so. We were just intimate together. We do not listen to her words. We don't accept her. Why? Because we suspect that maybe she's looking for a way out of the marriage. Maybe she's attracted to a certain man. She's hoping to get divorced so she can go and meet this other man. He says, however, she does lose the rights to her ksuba, both the fundamental requirement and the extra amount, and a right of any of her property that was destroyed, for she admitted that she had committed adultery. If he believes her and considers her word to be true, he's obligated to divorce her. So because there's a strong suspicion that maybe she's doing this just to get out of the marriage, he doesn't have to accept her word. But if he does accept her word, then he must divorce her. Court, however, does not obligate a man to divorce his wife through any means unless two witnesses came forth to testify that the person's wife willingly committed adultery in their presence, and then one is compelled to divorce his wife, as we mentioned before. Halacha 19. A woman who committed adultery unknowingly. Now, it's an unusual situation, but the halacha allows for it. That means she has relations with someone. She thought it was her husband at the time that she was intimate with them. It was dark. She was expecting her husband. Some other man was there, and they had relations. Or if a woman, God forbid, was raped. In those two situations, she's a married woman. She can continue. She's not forced to divorce. Okay, because as we said, he would be forced to divide. In the Torah, when it speaks about adultery, it says, and when she was not raped, meaning if she was raped, it's not considered adultery. and she wouldn't have to divorce her husband. Indicating that she was raped, she is permitted. This applies whether she was raped by a Jew or a non-Jew, God forbid. Whenever a woman was forced into relations at the outset, just as an interesting caveat, she said if a woman was forced into a relationship at the outset, in other words, she was being raped, even if through the act of the sexual act, she finds that she's enjoying it, even to the degree that she says, I would have paid this guy to have relations with, nonetheless, it's considered rape, and she would not have to divorce her husband. When women have been abducted by robbers, they are considered as though they have been taken captive and were raped. Basically, back in the day, it was if someone had ever been taken captive, you have to assume that she would have been raped, and similarly by robbers. If, however, they were left alone and they went back to the robbers in their own initiative, then they are considered to have acted willingly and would be forbidden to their husbands. This law applies to a woman who acted unwittingly and to one who was raped. The laws that apply to a woman who acted unwittingly, right? She thought she was having relations with her husband, or with somebody else, or she was raped. These laws are all the same. For acting unwittingly is comparable to a deed committed under coercion. That's just the rule. Halacha 21, when does the above apply? When when is it that a woman who was raped or had relations unwittingly with a person other than her husband, that she does not have to get divorced? That's an Israelite. However, if the husband was a Kohen, if she's married to a Kohen, whether it was unwittingly or under duress, she would now be forbidden to her husband. For these relations cause her to be deemed what the halacha calls a zona, and he is forbidden. A Kohen is forbidden to be married to a zona, to have relationships with her, as will be explained in the laws of forbidden relationships. And therefore, if this was a Kohen, he would have to divorce. Halacha 22, with regard to both an Israelite's wife and a priest's wife who have been raped, they are entitled to the ksuba. Okay? As if he chooses to divorce. Both the fundamental requirements and the additional amount. She does not lose anything in this regard, and we compel the priest to pay her money due to her by the virtue of her ksuba, and then he goes ahead with divorcing her. Halacha 23, we're coming towards the end now. When a priest's wife tells her husband, I was raped, or I was unwittingly had relations with another person, he should not pay any attention to her words, because again, we have the same suspicion of a woman married to an Israelite who comes along and says, I was raped, or I committed adultery. Why? Because in all these instances, there's a concern that maybe she's just fabricating the story in order to get out of the marriage. But if he believes her, okay, or he was told about it by another person upon whose words he relies, then he should divorce her, and he would have to pay the ksuba again because there's not witnesses. He cannot get away from paying the ksuba. The final halachot deal, as I mentioned before, with the sota. What is the sota? The following applies when a man tells his wife in the presence of witnesses, do not enter in privacy with so-and-so. So the conditions are, he says to his wife, a clear warning, so to speak. I don't want you to be in solitude with this man, and he does it in front of witnesses. And then what happens is, if two witnesses observe her entering into privacy with the said person, and she and he remain there sufficient time for relations to have taken place, so she's forbidden to engage in relations with her husband until he causes her to take the so-called drink the bitter waters. This is the sota waters, as we'll explain. There's detailed laws of this, so we'll deal with in the laws of sota. But until she drinks those waters, right, miraculously would either show her to have been, in fact, adulterous or not. And if she had been adulterous, it would have a devastating effect on her. She would pass away. So would the adulterer. But if not, if it turns out that it was a false kind of suspicion, then she would get an incredible blessing. Now, what happens if he tells her he's issued the warning, she's been witnessed in seclusion with this man, and now she has to drink the waters, and he passes away before she actually drinks, then she's not entitled to ksuba. No, why not? In other words, it's not yet proven one way or another, and it will never be proven now, because once he dies, she won't drink from the sota water. The end of the day is like this. Although the witnesses did not see any blatant wanton act, there is no more wanton act behavior than disobeying that warning of her husband. And that's the point. Even though we can't testify to the actual adulterous act, what we can certainly testify to is that these witnesses were there to see her warned, and witnesses now see her going into seclusion, which means going against the expressed wish and warning of the husband. In the present age, as after the temple times, when the waters to test the sota are not available to us, the woman becomes forbidden to her husband forever. So if a husband issues a warning in front of witnesses and then they They then testified that the Assyria going into seclusion with this man, she must be divorced without receiving the money due to her by the virtue of her ksuba, neither the fundamental requirements nor the additional amounts of the ksuba, for it is her evil deeds that cause her to become forgiven. Again, even though we can't prove the actual adulterous act, but what we do know is that she definitely went against this express warning of her husband. The final halacha, following law applies when a husband tells his wife in private, do not enter in seclusion with so-and-so. It's not in front of witnesses, right? As we said earlier. Now, if he observes her entering into seclusion with the said person and she and he remain there sufficient time for relations to have taken place, so now it's his word against her word. So in the present age, meaning when we don't have the possibility of going to the sut waters, the woman becomes forbidden to her husband. He's obligated to divorce her, but in this case, he must pay her the ksuba. As if she's a confirmed sota, he doesn't have to pay the ksuba. In this case, which was just his word, his warning, and he saw her, he would still have to pay the ksuba, unless she admits entering into seclusion with the said person after having received warning. Then she must be divorced without receiving the ksuba, because she exposes her own sort of bad behavior, and it's her own actions that bring about the result. Only afterwards must he pay the money due to her by virtue. Therefore, she is required to take an oath in this regard. Only afterwards would he have to pay her for the ksuba, because he wouldn't necessarily have to if she admitted to it or if there had been witnesses. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit longer, some interesting scenarios and the technical requirements around paying the ksuba and other monies owed after marriage.
Thank you.